right, in our last couple of sections of notes, we've been talking about the Second Industrial Revolution. We have been talking about American citizens heading west. We've talked about the Populism Party and how farmers and workers kind of come together to advocate for themselves and start to demand things of the federal government. For example, regulation of railroads, an income tax, secret ballots, direct election of senators, and so on and so on. And so in this section of notes, we're going to focus a little bit more on immigration. And we're going to be focusing a little bit on immigration within the United States, but also immigration from foreign countries. All right, so to define immigrant first, coming to and settling in a country of which one is not a native. In this section, we're also going to be talking about urbanization, and urbanization is just the movement of people to the cities and also the growth of those cities. We're also going to focus on the challenges in cities. So we've talked a little bit about the Second Industrial Revolution and how this brought people, again, to the cities and led to them working in factories in terrible working conditions with very little pay, long hours, long weeks. And we're going to go into a little bit more depth of that experience in the East. We're going to talk about the tenements in which they lived, the pollution that was spreading through the area, and the fact that we didn't even have simple garbage pickup. So, we're going to go into more depth of some of the challenges in the cities in our next set of notes. And again, in this section, we'll continue to focus on immigration. So between 1870 and 1920, about 20 million Europeans immigrated to the United States. For the first time, many of them came from Eastern and Southern Europe, unlike in the past. Okay, so reasons that they came. So the first reason here that we see many people move to the United States was because of religious persecution. So in Russia, Jews faced hostility, not from just their government, but also from Christian neighbors. And in the 1880s, a wave of pogroms, or violent massacres of Jews, swept across the country. The Tsar responded to the pogroms by sharply limiting where Jews could live and how they could earn a living. And Americans offered freedom of religion and the opportunity to build a new life. This offered Jews, land with the Homestead Act. Again, with the Homestead Act, they would be given 160 acres for a very cheap price, and they could keep the land as long as they built a house and then farmed it. They also had the opportunity to start over and maybe dream of being rich or striking gold. Personal freedoms, just being free. Opportunity to go to school. Young men weren't forced to serve long years in the military. And citizens could freely take part in the democratic government. We also saw some economic hardships in certain areas that brought people to the United States. And we also saw them immigrate for reform and political freedom. All right, so who else came? So from 1851 to 1883, about 300,000 Chinese immigrants came. Thousands came from Japan as well. And from 1880 to 1920, about 260,000 immigrants came from the Caribbean. Many Mexicans also came to the United States. And then from 1910 to 1930, 7 million immigrants came to escape the political turmoil in Mexico. We also see certain groups go to certain areas. So, for example, the Irish head to the New York City area in Boston, and then twice as many live in New York City than Dublin, actually. And Chicago has more Polish than Warsaw. Also during this time, we see farm technology kind of expand. And so this meant more crops, but it also meant that there would be a need for less workers. And so many start migrating to the city in order to find work. All right, so how did they come? Steamship, riding in the steerage, the cargo holds below the ship's waterline. Conditions were cramped with little light or air and very unclean. Many people suffered from diseases. So in the 1800s, the voyage was 2 to 3 weeks. In the 1900s, the voyage was about 1 week because they had more powerful steamships. And then depending on who you were, you might be offered better conditions. So for example, Japanese were becoming powerful at the time, and so they a lot of times received better treatment than, say, the Chinese, who had a weak country at the time. And then again, the steerage is just the area below the waterline of the ship, so the very, very bottom of a ship. And it was, again, very cramped, very uncomfortable, and diseases spread very, very quickly in this area. Those who arrived in New York were processed at Ellis Island. The process took about 5 hours and determined if they could enter the country or had to leave. 17 million immigrants passed from 1890 to 1925. Ellis Island was also known as the Golden Door. It was an island in the New York Harbor. At Ellis Island, each immigrant had to pass a physical and then prove they were not a felon, demonstrate they could work, and have $25. Those who arrived in San Francisco were processed at Angel Island, and these conditions were more unpleasant than at Ellis Island, and the processing was much stricter. This was an island. Angel Island was an island in San Francisco Bay that West Coast immigrants gained admission into the U.S. Passing was different than in the East Coast. Questions were a lot harder and longer, and the buildings were not as clean, and the workers were much harsher. Okay, so which region provided the greatest number of immigrants in 1910? So we're looking at this area right here, 1910. So the largest would be Central Europe, 275,000. This group here was mostly German, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Austria-Hungary. All right, so once in the United States, immigrants felt confused and worried by the new culture. Many settled in communities with other immigrants from the same country to feel more at home, and they also formed organizations to help each other. This was also known as cooperation. So once admitted into the country, life was crazy. There was language, culture, working problems for these new Americans, and many cities had ethnic communities where the native culture, language, and religion were practiced. Rise of nativism. Many people did not want particular groups to immigrate to America. These groups were the Slavs, Latin, Asian races. These races were seen historically as low education and no value to the country. Those same people did not mind if groups of German or English came to America. We also saw an anti-Asian sentiment. The main reason for this was their different culture, different looks, and extremely foreign language. So understand that nativism is just people who oppose immigration because they feel their culture will be lost or blended in with a new one. And one can be said to believe in nativism if they feel this way towards a certain group. Okay, so anti-immigration feelings spread among some Americans. During the Depression of the 1870s, many workers feared they would lose their jobs to Chinese immigrants who accepted much lower wages. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, banning all but a few Chinese immigrants. The ban was not lifted until 1943. The United States and Japan reached a gentleman's agreement in 1907 and 1908, under which Japan restricted migration to the United States. So the Chinese Exclusion Act actually banned entries to all Chinese, except students, teachers, tourists, and government officials. And during the Depression of the 1870s, many workers feared they would lose their jobs to Chinese immigrants who accepted lower wages, and often this did happen. With the gentleman's agreement, San Francisco schools segregated all Chinese, Japanese, and Korean schools. In response, anti-American riots took place, and President Roosevelt agreed to end the segregation, and Japan agreed to limit immigration in response.